Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast, where I get to dig into delicious conversations with global leaders and we get to soak up their wisdom and perspective on all things life and leadership. And today I am absolutely thrilled to welcome the wonderful Henriette Rothschild. Henriette, welcome.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Great to be here with you.
Lovely to have you here
Finally.
with me. I know, finally. Let me share for our audience, and we'll get into that we've known each other for quite a long time, and we were CEOs together at one stage. We'll go through all of that, but let me touch on your bio for people that haven't had the pleasure of meeting you before. So Henriette Rothschild has got a depth of experience in executive roles, commercial, operational, and people, as well as deep experience as a non-executive director on high-profile boards. Today, Henriette works as a partner at Mentha, specialising in complex turnarounds. Prior to joining Mentha, Henriette was the Chief Operating Officer for iSelect and was also Managing Director of the global consulting firm Hay Group, looking after Australia, New Zealand, Japan and Korea. Henriette is a board member at Richmond Football Club, an independent director at the Brown Family Wine Group, and until recently was a non-executive director at Crown Melbourne. Henriette, brilliant, as I said, to have you here. Let's kick off with everyone's favourite question. Who are you as a human being?
That's the hardest one of all that you start with. I am someone who was born in Denmark to a Norwegian mother, which actually helps to shape you as a person in itself. Grew up in Denmark until I was 10 years old when the family moved to Australia to build a new life here. I've got a gorgeous sister, Marianne, who's a violinist. And I've got two gorgeous girls, Annika and Alette. I have two Labradors that keep me very busy, and a gorgeous partner, Mark. And from a work perspective, as you probably as you were summarising the various roles, I'm someone that likes to be busy and likes to get involved in fixing things, and pretty hands-on, and have a reasonably high amount of energy for getting involved in a wide range of interesting things. I've got a lot of curiosity of things business related, but also outside of business. I'm very passionate about football and live music. That's a little bit about.
Fantastic. I love how you've put a bit of colour and depth on there too, and welcomed every member of the family, including the Labradors.
Yeah, exactly.
To the conversation. So, Henriette, one of the things that I have just always absolutely loved, and to share with the audience, we have known each other for a while and we're friends as well, but one of the things that I just absolutely love is very strategic and carefully considered about building what is just such a wonderfully rich career that has got so many elements of things that you love in it as well. And I know your story is going to resonate with so many people. I want to really dig into the CEO phase, as you and I have spoken about. But if we can go right back to, how did your career get kicked off? Where were you heading when you first started your career?
So I'd always loved working. So even at school and as a student, I always had part-time jobs. So I loved the world of work. I studied psychology and was going to become a psychologist, and that was in the late 80s, early 90s. I discovered as I was studying psychology that you could do this thing that was just emerging called organizational psychology that I hadn't really understood much about before. And that seemed pretty good. It combined my enjoyment around people, and which is the psychology part of it, but with business, which I also really liked. So I ended up going on and doing study into psychology, and then ended up in a graduate role in the human resources area at SmithKline Beecham, a pharmaceutical company, and continued to study to become a qualified organizational psychologist. So that was my first entry out of uni, and sort of some postgraduate study as well as supervised training as an org psych in the early 90s.
And so interesting, how did you get from there? Like, were you inspired at that point that thinking I'm going to be a CEO one day? Was it ever on your radar?
Oh, I was always pretty ambitious, and I also have a very strong curiosity and love of learning and doing new things. So I think what really helped in that environment, and context is always important. Pharmaceuticals those days is kind of what the tech companies are today. It was well resourced. They looked after people very well. They invested a lot in people. They also had a very strong view that if you wanted to go into general management, you had to move across functions. You couldn't sit in a very narrow role in, say, finance or HR. So there was already a context that encouraged that. So I think through the time there was a merger of SmithKline Beecham and Sterling Health, and the opportunity came up to move to New Zealand for a couple of years to integrate the two organisations. That gave me an opportunity to be on a leadership team at the age of 25 on the executive team of New Zealand. That I think probably spurred me on further to wanting to really work across the business, because in that environment I had to get exposed to, not only to finance pretty heavily, but also sales and marketing and so forth. So that really, I guess, gave me the entry into working across functions, which, if none of that had happened, I would probably have continued to really covet that training manager role, which I thought was going to be the absolute bee's knees when I'd started, because that looked like an awesome job. And I thought that was what I really wanted to do in the world. And I was really miffed that that opportunity didn't come up. But of course, the opportunity to move to New Zealand for a couple of years and run an integration during a merger or an acquisition actually opened up far more opportunities that I could have hoped for.
Are you still secretly hoping for that training role?
Yeah, no, I haven't thought about it for a little while. Maybe that's what I'll be coveting next. But at the time, it's interesting what really grabs you at a point in time. But also, I think I was also really mindful that there was going to be different opportunities that I couldn't even fully foresee. Taking a bit of a risk, moving to Auckland wasn't quite like the idea of moving to London or New York that I'd originally thought about. It was a very small market, and yet it also meant that in a smaller environment, and I've learned that in smaller organisations, you sometimes get involved in more things than you would in a larger environment where you are more niche. For example, going to a training role.
Yeah.
It's allowed me to get involved in managing payroll and managing all the admin staff, as well as dealing with a lot of exits and so forth. So it was just an incredible learning experience, working really hard early in the morning, late at night, and driving some really really strong sense of what it took to run a small business over there. That then inspired me then to come back to the same organisation back in Australia and go into sales and marketing. So that gave me that sort of real cross-functional experience.
So what prompted leaving there? Or where did you go next?
So I stayed with, was with SmithKline Beecham for probably about 8.5, 9 years. And it then went into a bit of a holding pattern, because at that time there's a lot of mergers. And as part of that, the organisation needed to cut costs, go into a bit of a holding pattern. And so in marketing, it meant that a lot of the budgets got cut, the headcount got cut and so forth. So I was sitting in a marketing role, all dressed up and nowhere to go is what it felt like. And as I said, I was quite ambitious at that point in time. So it just happened that the person that had been my supervisor when I was becoming a psychologist was working at a company called Hay Group, and said, you'd make a great consultant. And I thought, well, consulting sounds like a bit of a sort of empty role. Like what do you really do? It seemed a bit like I'd never really understood what consultants did. But I thought, well, I've been in pharmaceuticals and consumer health now for nearly 8, 9 years as my first role. It's probably really important to get some cross-industry experience. I've had cross-functional experience. I needed to build the cross-industry experience. So I thought maybe if I did that for a couple of years, go into Hay Group, work as a consultant for a couple of years, and then decide which industry I wanted to settle down in, that would give me some great insights. And I moved across to Hay Group as a senior consultant, and as it turned out, ended up staying there 16 years.
And moving into the managing role while you were there as well, how far into the tenure was that, and sort of how did that opportunity come about?
Yeah, so I worked my way through various roles at Hay Group, ending up running the business consulting part of it, which again really was bringing together all these various functions. It had leadership, it had culture, but also business and a strong element of turnaround. So we did a bit of work with mergers and acquisitions, and I really enjoyed that. Loved the messiness of it and getting in and the intellectual challenge of solving these business problems. And during that time I also had 2 kids, and so it's a great time. A truly global company. It was a partnership that was owned by about 120 of us. I bought into the partnership probably about 10 years into being in that environment, which ended up being a good investment when it was sold. But it was a fantastic opportunity to sort of work across borders, across boundaries. The GFC hit, and consulting was a challenging environment to be at the GFC, and we lost something like 25-30% of revenue in a really short period of time in about 2008. So at the end of 2008, the managing director of the region, the Asia Pacific region, came to me and said, "I'd like you to consider taking on the managing director role." Our incumbent managing director had at that point in time left and had been moved back to the UK. So it was a pretty tough environment to even think about moving into the CEO role, which meant that I did what all good, capable women do. I said, "Oh, great opportunity. Thank you so much for thinking about me, but I'm not sure that this is the right thing for me at this point in time."
Excellent. And the next conversation was?
The next conversation was the managing director saying, "Right, and why is that?" And I explained, "Well, I've got young kids and I haven't run a P&L. I've managed budgets before, but I've never run a P&L, and it would be great to learn from someone." And as I was rabbiting on, he said, "Right, so you want me to take this guy over here and put him in charge, and you can report to him. How does that sound?" He said it in a slightly more colourful way, but I won't repeat.
Clever.
I won't repeat the exact words, you can imagine. When confronted with someone that I'd be reporting into, as opposed to this ideal that I had in my mind of this perfect CEO that would walk in that I would learn from, I thought, well, I can do a better job than he can.
Yes.
And so it was actually the motivation that I needed, because it made it very real that there isn't this perfect person that can run these organizations. They're all humans. They all have strengths and weaknesses, and I, like other humans, had strengths and weaknesses. There wasn't any reason why I wouldn't do a better job, or at least as good a job as someone else. So it was a very compelling way of convincing me. So I decided to take it on at the end of 2008, I think it was. I took on that fairly challenging role of what was initially a pretty strong turnaround, coming right in the belly of the GFC, when people had just cut right back on consulting spend.
So the question I love to ask of everyone when they reflect back on their first CEO role is, what do you remember? I mean, do you remember what it felt like stepping into that role?
Yes. It was daunting. So you talk about brave leadership. I definitely needed that sense of courage. There was another really capable person, not the person that had been referred to, that had been a colleague of mine, that didn't get the role. There were other people that had been my peers that I now was their manager. So I remember feeling concerned about how I managed that dynamic. There was a couple of fairly senior people, one in particular, who called me on sort of day 2 or 3 when this had been announced, and she said, "Well, what would you know about running an organization like this?" And I said, "Oh, well, I guess I've been part of the executive team for a while, and I've run this area." And she said, "Oh, well, you must be terrified." And it wasn't said in a supportive way. So I remember a couple of those conversations, but probably more than that, I do remember a lot of people saying, "Let me know what help you need. This is fantastic. Well done on taking on the challenge. We know it's hard. We know that, the situation's difficult. Let us know what we can do." Lots of people with incredible support of me and taking that on. So I think that's always an important lesson, that even though they can be lonely roles, there's a heap of support and help that people want to give, both to you as an individual, but also the role. The CEO role actually garners respect, and it does have people, for either sometimes out of self-interest, sometimes out of selflessness. But there's a lot of people you can draw on to help, to get advice. You still need to have your own sense of self and your own really strong sense of decision making, so you're not listening to too many noisy voices. But there is a lot of support to be gained if you're open to it. So that's probably one of my initial kind of thoughts about that, walking in what it feels like.
And you were successful in the work that you did there. What do you, if you had to boil that down to, the couple of things that probably led to your success, what would they be?
Well, I'd say one thing, we were leading in a downturn, and I actually think that leading in a downturn or leading when there's financial distress is actually arguably easier than leading growth. There's something very galvanizing about a 30% drop in revenue. That means that there's no negotiation and no debate about what you've got to do. So it really focuses. So as a new CEO coming in, it actually helped that there was absolute clarity on what we had to do. And so if anyone wasn't on the bus, it was easy to say, well, we don't have room for you. But most people jumped straight on board, and everyone said, right, what can we do? We needed to cut costs in every area. We needed to defer costs in some cases. We needed to sublet part of the office. It was quite, it was a real turnaround. And actually, it is easier, I think, to, as I said, to manage a really problematic or distressed situation because it's clear what you've got to do. Yeah, there's no negotiation, and you're not trying to build momentum and galvanize everyone to a particular direction. Well, I mean, you do, but it's largely spelled out for you. So I think that was an important thing. Then ensuring that you are clear about how you're going to get through, and that you've got enough people. You won't have everyone on board, but that you've got enough people that can see that future state and buy into it, so that you're not trying to pull everyone in that direction on your own. I think that's critically important, but also articulating, what does success look like? I think that clarity, and I think that's something that I always try to bring to organizations and to the work that I do. There's a lot of noise, and I think it just is getting more complex every single day. I'm dealing with organizations that are going through both rapid growth, and that, as I said, I think can sometimes be harder, as well as downturns. And your ability to take all this noise and mess and complexity and boil it down to what are the few things that we absolutely have to get right, and what's your role in that? And we talked about that at Hay Group often. It was about clarity and accountability. I think is a really key underpinning for successful CEOs in many, many different environments that I see, and just good leadership.
Did you have any trouble at all in terms of letting go of your old responsibilities? I mean, some of the things I hear a lot from mentoring CEOs and others is, it's that whole question mark about, am I too operational? Am I too in the weeds? Or am I being strategic enough? Or was that ever something that you kind of grappled with?
I think it's something you grapple with every day, and in board roles as well. You think about that. In executive roles, you think about that. I think part of that is about self-awareness of what made you successful, but also what's different about the role. Because one of the things I'd say about CEO roles is that they're discontinuous, and by that I mean what got you to the CEO role isn't what you need in the CEO role. So being really mindful about what's different and articulating that. Now, at Hay Group, I was really lucky. People there really understood roles, they understood work, they understood leadership. That also meant you got a lot of feedback, sometimes unsolicited, but feedback is a gift, as we used to say. But that you really think about what is it that's different about this role, and so that it's that constantly reminding yourself, rather than just, because when you're busy, when there's a lot going on, you can easily default back to your comfort zone. For some people, it might be that they were the CFO and they go straight into the numbers. And I see that a lot, actually. When we go from Quartermentha into distressed organisations, if the CEO was out of the finance function, often what you see is that they've gone into financial controller mode. The problem with that is that they might do some good cost management, great, but no one's then articulating the vision of how you get to the other side. Like, how do you get through this? What's the vision? What's the growth? What's the revenue solution to this? And so therefore there's a vacuum. So I think it's constantly challenging yourself on what is your unique role that only you can play, that you get help from others, but you've got to be really focused on that. So I think that's, an important part of it.
Did you have important sort of sponsors or advocates along the way?
Yeah, and I think that's critically important. My main one was this guy, Israel, that I mentioned, that asked me to take on the role. He made it very clear that he had my back. He knew that there was gaps that I was looking to fill, and that they felt that all the strengths that I had that I brought to it were more than enough to make up for areas where I would need extra support. Before that, I'd had a number of people in that environment, again, supporting and advocating. And I think that's one of the things I would say makes the biggest difference, that sort of advocacy, and also sponsorship when you're not in the room, not people that just tell you you're doing a good job to your face. But in boardrooms, I see it all the time, where someone's saying, oh yeah, there's someone in this role, what are they like? And what comes out of people's mouths next can make or break people's, I wouldn't say careers, it's a bit dramatic, but at least their short-term career steps. So that the role that people play in positive advocacy and sponsorship of others is incredibly important. And I feel that I was lucky enough at Hay Group to have a number of people at executive tables that had seen the work I'd done with clients, that had seen the way that I'd led teams, that were very positive about the impact that I could have, and therefore talk positively about me when I wasn't in the room, which then created these opportunities. And I would really say to your followers, the more that they can think about the way that they can play that role for other people, I think that's incredibly powerful.
I loved before how you talked about feedback as a gift, and it is a gift, and we don't
sometimes
we don't always love what we hear when we hear it. But that's my next question. Was there feedback that you needed to hear along the way? Did someone give you a real gift?
Yes, absolutely. Many, many times. I think one of the important, there was a lot. Hay Group was very big at lots of 360s and 180s and all kinds of feedback situations, and in the moment, unprompted. For me, a couple of things. One is what you are intending isn't always what's being received. So you can be an awesome leader in your own mind. You can be setting a vision. You can be, espousing great direction and creating clarity and accountability. But if that's not what's being received, either because the way you're communicating it and conveying it is not being heard, or because the person can't hear it for some reason, you're actually just being a legend in your own lunchtime. It's not helping anyone.
Yes.
So I definitely got feedback on a number of times of, effectively, we see what you're trying to do here, but it's not how it's coming across. For me, it was always, I'd have high energy and I'd be rushing at things, and I'd be 100 miles an hour, and I'd be assuming everyone was with me, and sometimes people were just still processing the first paragraph. So understanding the impact and understanding your intent and also how it's being received was really important. I went on to be the Chief Operations Officer at iSelect. Very, very different environment. And there I had about 500 or so people, largely call center, very sales-driven culture. I think the average age was 27, 75% male. And the first couple of presentations I got up to give, I did it as I had been very successful at doing at Hay Group, which was a highly educated, very self-motivated, articulate, critical audience. So every data piece had to be right. And so I went and I had this really nicely pulled together presentation, and sort of 10 minutes into it, I could see people just glazing over of what are you talking about? And you could see at 20 minutes, I thought I was really hitting my stride, and you could see the sort of murmuring of, she's still talking. But what was really clear was, in that context, the way that I've been leading in, at Hay Group, working in Collins Street in Melbourne and so forth, was very different to out in Cheltenham, what it was going to take for me to engage and connect with that group. So I very quickly learned that, again, my intent, which was to be visionary and to show direction and show clarity and so forth, wasn't how it was being received at all. What I needed was probably 5 minutes at absolute most, with a couple of really clear messages. some real positive energy around what it meant for individuals, and then allow others to contribute. So it was just that sort of realization. So I do keep getting that feedback from time to time. What you're intending is not actually what's being received.
So, well, we'll move on to iSelect, but I'm interested in that transition point. You referenced before that Hay Group was sold. So, there was a clear end point to that, so to speak. Did it feel like reinventing yourself after that? Like, tell us about that journey and how iSelect came about.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity not to reinvent myself, but I did decide that after 16 years at Hay Group, that was the opportunity. So it was quite a deliberate choice to move away from continuing that next sort of phase with Hay Group and Corn Ferry. And in doing that, I did need to sort of create a bit of a clean break and make a decision about what was next. So part of that was a bit of reflection on what were the things that were missing, what were the things I wanted to add. So I felt like I'd actually done a good job of building cross-functional experience. I'd developed a lot of cross-industry experience, working from education to mining to financial services to FMCG. So it was an opportunity to sort of reflect on what was it that I wanted that next phase to be. And I was keen on a couple of things. One was I loved the opportunity to have a direct P&L management. So that needed to be part of whatever I took on next. I was really keen to continue to build on digital experience and more online and really, I guess, building that capability. I was really interested in the idea of an Australian-based and particularly listed company experience because I hadn't had that. So there was quite a deliberate process of thinking about what those elements were that either needed rounding out or that I really wanted to double down on. And so it took a while, and it required me to knock back a few really good opportunities, and that takes real bravery and courage.
Absolutely.
Because sometimes it can be quite easy to take the role that's in front of you, particularly if it's being well paid and particularly if it's got good status and nice perks and all this sort of thing. But I felt that there was an opportunity there to do something different. And if I didn't do that at that point in time, I would just I wouldn't be stretching myself. I wouldn't be being courageous enough, and I would end up sort of locking into that whole professional services environment and just being at risk of becoming a bit complacent.
Yeah. Okay. So iSelect, that was a journey.
It was absolutely loved it. As I mentioned, it took me a couple of goes of figuring out how do you speak to a very different group. The CEO left fairly soon after I started, so I ended up taking on that sort of chief operating, chief commercial role, and one of the board members stepped in as an interim CEO. I was running each of the lines of business, the P&Ls for energy, telco, insurances, health insurance, car insurance, and so forth, and also life insurance and mortgages at a time that the regulatory landscape in Australia was ramping up. Yes. And iSelect, at that time, it was a listed company, so there was some rigor around aspects of it. But at the same time, the regulatory landscape was changing very quickly. And this had been a very, very aggressive sales culture, which wasn't always prioritising compliance and regulatory processes. So there was a lot of work to be done on that. There was also a lot of work to be done to change from an individualistic sales culture to a much more customer-centric organisation. So there was a heap of turnaround, and at the same time, I learned a lot about the challenges of going out with guidance. The board and CEO had gone out with guidance fairly early on in the piece, and of course, when you then don't hit guidance, you get punished really hard. So that we were dealing with a tanking share price, and also ACCC coming after us on the basis of some advertising issues, and definitely some errors on a website on one page. It was quite interesting how that all played out. But dealing with an ACCC challenge. And then there was a lot of regulatory changes in energy that meant that entire sites and compliance scripts and so forth had to be changed very, very quickly. So it was a really, really interesting, challenging, fraught environment. which again reinforced the importance of getting a really good group of people, people who had clarity on what they needed to deliver, were galvanized both by the turnaround, but also then by figuring out how you sort of got through it as well. So it was a wild ride, I'd say, and one that I enjoyed very much, and still, look forward to the day when I'll be able to work with various people that I was working with at that point in time in the future.
And then Cortamenta. So how did that, and, this was probably part of the story that, it was probably the first time when you and I talked about that I sat back and thought, wow, you really you are putting pieces together here. Like it was really considered. So can you share with the audience the kind of consideration about then stepping into the organisation you're with now?
Yes, so there was the opportunity to look at that, taking on that CEO role at iSelect. And at that point in time, that was what I thought that I had joined to do. I was quite keen. We're now from 26 back down to 25 women running ASX 300 companies. I think that's appalling. It's very disappointing, and I definitely wanted to be someone that would lean into taking on one of those roles and encouraging a lot of other women to take those roles too, to increase that number and to ensure that we're making the best of the talent pool. Having said all of that and having a really strong set of belief around that, at the time that opportunity came up, the needs of the organisation were to do probably a bit of balance sheet restructure, potentially look at just ideally a sale was clear that the board was sort of thinking about, or recapitalising. There was some fairly significant financial challenges, and I felt my real skill set was to build the team, to grow the business, to do the operational turnaround. But when it came to the balance sheet restructure, it was not a skill set that I had, and I thought learning that, facing into as a part of a listed company, was fraught. And so it was one of those times where I actually decided that was a mindful no rather than a courageous yes, and that I wouldn't take that on. But in realising that, I had spoken with people at Cortamenta. They obviously have deep experience in this area, and I talked about where I would get that sort of experience, and they suggested actually coming and working with them, contributing my operational turnaround and sort of consulting experience, while also learning the ropes here at Cortamenta, which has been a great way of really adding that hard-edge financial turnaround skill set to what is otherwise a strong operational culture turnaround skill set that I've got.
Okay, so you are in a privileged position to sit on a number of high-profile boards, which means you get to not only have been a CEO yourself. You go into companies and do turnarounds and all sorts of different things. So we get a chance to ask the question from a different perspective or a different lens with you as well. What would you call out firstly as, let's think about the turnaround situations you face. So when you see companies in distress, can you highlight what you think some of the things are that maybe a CEO could have done differently or better?
Yep. Look, a couple of things. I think first and foremost, one of the most consistent elements of a CEO that fails, in inverted commas, is when there's misalignment between the board and the CEO, particularly the chair and the CEO. That tends to be a pretty consistent piece when something's going wrong. Now, what causes what, is an interesting theoretical debate. It doesn't actually matter.
No.
If there's not alignment between the chair and the CEO, it's usually the CEO that comes off second best. And therefore, I think if you're thinking about going into a CEO role, or if you're thinking about how you're performing in the CEO role, I think the starting point is always the level of alignment with the board and the CEO, because that is inevitably that will either safeguard you as a CEO, ensure that you're set up for success, or will be part of your demise, if I can put it that way. I think they're probably that's inevitably the case. There are always so that would be the first, second, and third, I'd say, is that board CEO and chair CEO alignment. The The second piece is where you've been in the role for a while, you've often seen ups and downs. And so I think sometimes what a longer term CEO can fail to do is realize when there's actually an ongoing trend. It's not just a blip. So I've seen in fairly recent times, probably about 3 or 4 CEOs that are overseeing what is clear to many other people is a decline, but what they see it as is, oh, it's just a blip. And often why they're seeing that is because they're looking at their numbers month on month or year on year. They're not looking at that 5-year trend, 6-year trend that says, no, this is actually different. You know, right now, margins are really squeezed, revenues are quite challenging. There's been, you know, high costs of, you know, supply chain, or salaries have been increasing. And so you're seeing people just waiting for this temporary blip in revenue downturn to, you know, to fix. And then there's this hopeful hockey stick. So I think a failure to recognize that actually the market's changing, the competitor set's changing, and it's not a blip, it's an ongoing trend, and therefore not being quick enough to adapt to that. So I think the third thing we often hear when we go in where there is distress is it was a perfect storm. And it was a perfect storm is usually, well, there was regulatory changes, there was salary increases, we lost one of our major contracts. It was a perfect storm. But actually, if you'd looked at it over a 3 or 4 year period, you will probably have seen the signs of that. But either a brand new, inexperienced CEO or a more complacent CEO that feels like they've actually got it all have failed to see that. So that's sort of, there are probably a couple of reasons we see things going wrong, or where, if you like, CEOs haven't managed as well as they could have, and have put the organisation or themselves in a vulnerable position.
What about recruiting for CEOs? What are some of the things that, you know, you and your colleagues at board level consider when you're looking to fill a role?
Look, I think we would have better CEOs if there are always good, robust processes. And I think there are a lot of robust processes, but sometimes I think people start by imagining the right person in the role. And what do they use to imagine? They use what they've seen before.
Yes.
So I think one of the things that's really important is, and I've been involved in recently, the CEO search for Richmond Football Club, the CEO search for Brown Family Wine Group, and I've contributed to a number of client organisations recently as well, not as a recruiter, but more just as someone sort of advising on the needs of the organisation and the you know situation that's going on. I think it always starts with what's the situation that they're walking into? What is the context? What is the cycle, the life cycle of the organisation at that point in time? Is it a turnaround? Is it a rapid growth? Is it a deal with regulatory pressures? Because there's a lot of those at the moment. And therefore, what are the skills and capabilities needed before you imagine the person? Because I think so often we all have in our mind's eye probably a strapping alpha male dealing with these, whether it's rapid growth or battling, you know, a strong financial turnaround, rather than saying, well, actually what you're needing is really strong stakeholder management, really nuanced ability to manage a regulator and understand all the elements. You know, it might be really strong operational management. It might be detailed financial acumen. There could be any of these, which may be a more reserved, you know, introvert, not the big alpha.
Yes.
It may be more female. It may, you know, that. So actually thinking about all the characteristics that are needed at that point in time, because as we always used to say at Hey Group, behaviour, and in this case, the behaviour of a CEO is a function of the person in combination with the situation. So you can't ignore the situation you're in and only focus on the characteristics of the person, but also recognise the characteristics that are needed for that point in time. So, you know, there's, in terms of then more detailed, identifying those priorities, potentially working with a good recruiter, or, you know, bringing those skills around the boardroom table, assessing a wide field and making sure there's some wild cards in there, and making sure there's good diversity in there before you start narrowing down the funnel too quickly. I think they're all important elements.
And, you know, I guess then, therefore, you end up in situations where people assume someone's going to get it. But, you know, if you go through that process properly and you've got a broad field of candidates, you imagine it differently.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been involved in a couple of situations recently where the person that was expected to go into it ended up not getting into it. not because they weren't great or not because they didn't have great skills. It was just what the situation required something different. And in that case, the board had really spent some time beforehand identifying the characteristics needed, so that by the time we then looked at the candidates against the characteristics required, it took a lot of the heat out of the personality aspects, because you were able to pretty clearly identify that one person was able to demonstrate some of those skills more clearly than someone else.
So your organisational psychology background has really underpinned so much of your career, hasn't it?
It has. And I think what's really interesting is I go on to various boards, some of the HR and people capabilities are actually what is drawn on more than what I would have thought, which would have been more the financial and commercial.
Yes.
Interestingly, a lot of the financial and commercial are dealt with in the organisation and reviewed at board level, but actually as a board, you're often thinking about CEO succession and CEO performance and the nomination process for board members and the dynamics in the boardroom, the dynamics with the executive and so forth. So I really do think that, that really understanding the skills matrix required on the boards are interesting, because those people and organisational psych skills are incredibly valuable, I think, on most boards today.
I'm fascinated in your response or your thoughts around why we don't have more female CEOs. And just as I reflect back on, your story you've shared with us today, you've given us an example of turning down the first opportunity, but then being convinced it was right, a mindful no on the second opportunity. Why don't we have more female CEOs?
Look, I usually have a million answers to this, but my first one is I really don't know.
Yeah.
I really don't know, because we've got a lot of very, very, very capable people out there. Yep. But I'll hazard a guess at some things. The latest Chief Executive Women Census has made it clear that there's not enough women in those pipeline or feeder roles, which is the P&L roles. So definitely, I'd encourage women at that mid-level to get into and stay in P&L roles. That definitely helps, because you do need to be able to navigate really tough financial situations. I've not, since I've been a managing director, there's never been a situation where I haven't been dealing with really tough financial situation. You need to be confident and comfortable around that. I also think that we tend to have, though, as I said, a rear vision view of what a good leader looks like. And so therefore there is probably an overemphasis on some of the characteristics that are useful but not actually essential, and an underemphasis on, for example, the stakeholder management, the people management, the navigating personalities, and strong, complex commercial relationships that often requires those skills that often are more associated with female leadership. So the sponsorship and advocacy, I think, is important, both from within the organisation and outside. And I really encourage anyone that gets involved, whether it's in boards or recruitment, for example, to be thinking about, challenging the thinking that it needs to be someone that has already been there, done that, because I think that that's a challenge. I also think, talking to a group of younger women recently, where I sort of was apologising that we hadn't made enough of a difference, that we hadn't made it. I thought we would be at parity and equity and so forth by this time. I didn't realise it would be as hard as it is. One of the things that they said, which I think is quite true of some women, is that the CEO role is a coveted role. There's a lot of people competing for it. And a lot of women will go into that role if they feel supported, if they feel that it's offered to them, if they feel encouraged and pushed into it. They don't want to go into battle with a peer only to go in and then be fearful of being white-anted. Whereas, and I don't know if that's our upbringing or whatever, but women can be ambitious, but they don't, in many cases, want to be fighting someone for a role. It's almost like, well, if you want it that much, you take it. I don't want to fight you for it. I do think that there's an element of that self-talk that goes on for an individual. And therefore, the need for advocacy and sponsorship becomes really important, so that you know that, yes, there will be the naysayers, and there always are. You don't go into leadership roles because you want people to turn up to your desk to say you're doing a great job and everything's going well. You go into those roles because you're prepared to be challenged, because you know it's going to be tough. But I think it's a matter of how tough will it be. So therefore, I think that advocacy and support is something that a lot of women want to feel, so that they know they're set up for success, or at least that they have as good a shot as anyone else at having success.
Did you enjoy your CEO role?
Absolutely. I loved it. And I think a couple of things that did surprise me, in many cases, it wasn't as hard as I thought, because there is definitely people respond differently to the role. And that was a big surprise for me going in there, because as at that time, younger female in that role, people definitely respond, I don't quite know how to express it, but there was a sort of deference towards the role that I'd never experienced as an individual. And so therefore you are actually able to make choices and make calls and be listened to and have a voice when you're in that role. So that makes it easier. You can control your diary more when you're in that role. You can choose when you're going to travel and when you're not going to travel. So, just so going into it, there was actually not as hard. And in fact, I think it's easier in many cases to be the CEO than it is to be in middle management.
Absolutely. I say that to people all the time.
Yeah.
Definitely. So the final question that I ask everybody, so in case people miss that, that is an ad for both of us saying, go into a CEO role.
Yeah.
Don't look back, don't think about it, go for that CEO role.
Mm.
The final question, Henriette, I'd love your perspective on. What does brave feminine leadership mean to you? And do you think it needs to change?
To me, those words, brave feminine leadership, is about bringing your whole authentic self to a leadership role. It's not about trying to emulate someone else. It's not about trying to be someone else. It hopefully encapsulates a future-oriented approach. I think it's also, if you like, a call to action, brave feminine leadership for women to say, be courageous, be yourself, and take on leadership roles. The word brave, though, also says that there's a level of courage that's really needed. And so I think that's also a kind of a call to action for men, to encourage women into those roles, to recognise the value of diversity, to recognise the value and the need at times for women to have people that help them to lower the courage required. We're all happy to take on the courage, but sometimes the bravery required sometimes feels too much for some people. So I think it's a call to action. I don't think brave feminine leadership needs to change. I think our ability to value that in corporate leadership roles needs to keep evolving.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your generosity in joining us and sharing your story today, Henriette. I've loved it.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So great to be part of your amazing organisation that's growing and thriving, and wish you all the best as well as you keep talking to many more people and getting lots more views.